Tortoises and turtles are among the most ancient of terrestrial vertebrates. Forms morphologically similar to those still living were present before the age of dinosaurs. But the huge land tortoises living today on the Galapagos Islands are not surviving giant forms persisting from the age of reptiles. Rather, they are new giant forms derived from small continental types which have reached these islands in the relatively recent past. The Galapagos Islands did not rise out of the sea until toward the end of the age of mammals. At first, of course, they had no terrestrial life. All of the land animals and plants which have reached these islands have had to disperse over several hundred miles of open sea. This constitutes a filter that has kept most continental animals from reaching the Galapagos. However, reptiles, including tortoises, are pre-adapted for transoceanic dispersal. Because of their extremely low metabolic rate, they can go without food for weeks at a time while drifting on a natural raft or floating across the open sea. In relation to this, it's striking that the principal non-flying terrestrial vertebrates in the Galapagos Islands are all reptiles. Once these reptiles got to the Galapagos, they found a new matrix of selective forces and ecological factors which allowed them to change, or indeed favored evolutionary change in them. Thus, on the mainland of South America, there is a small tortoise still persisting, which occupies a very restricted niche in the arid parts of the west coast. This animal, or one similar to it, reaching the Galapagos, would have found no competition whatsoever from more advanced mammalian herbivores. In fact, it would have been the only grazing or browsing terrestrial vertebrate in the islands. Land tortoises can literally eat anything they can bite. Thus, all of the vegetation on the islands was a potential food source for them. In the absence of competition, the tortoises have increased in size by an order of magnitude. Animals weighing 250 or 300 pounds are commonplace. Very old individuals may weigh as much as 600 pounds. In this regard, the evolution of large size in the Galapagos tortoise parallels the history of many island forms. Other examples of insular gigantism include the dodo, a giant pigeon of Mauritius, the giant land tortoises of Aldabra in the Indian Ocean, and the Komodo dragon, a giant monitor lizard of the East Indies. Other things being equal, size is advantageous for a vertebrate because size enhances mobility. This increased mobility may have been of critical importance in the Galapagos because of the scattered nature of edible vegetation on most of the islands. Populations of tortoises developed on most of the larger islands of the Galapagos archipelago. These populations were isolated from one another and evolved into separate races, distinguished primarily by variations in the shapes of their shells. The extremes are a dome-like form and a saddleback form.
Herman Melville, writing of his visit to the Galapagos in 1841. That these tortoises are the victims of a penal or malignant, or perhaps a downright diabolical enchanter, seems in nothing more likely than in that strange infatuation of hopeless toil which so often possesses them. I have known them in their journeyings to ram themselves heroically against rocks, and long abide there, nudging, wriggling, wedging, in order to displace them and so hold on their inflexible path. Their crowning curse is their grudging impulse to straightforwardness in a belittered world.
the tortoise is more completely encased in armor than any other vertebrate that's ever lived. This bony armor, which completely encompasses the body and to which the ribs and backbone are fused, presents acute mechanical problems. For example, a tortoise cannot change the diameter of its body. In fact, the only way it can breathe is by shifting all of the peritoneal content so as to alter the volume of the lung. This is sometimes done by moving the legs slowly in and out of the shell. For many years it was thought that the swallowing, or gular pumping, which is so obvious in the tortoise, functioned as a device for injecting air into the lungs. But it now appears that this gular pumping is the tortoise's equivalent of sniffing and serves a purely olfactory function. When tortoises walk, they also face problems, because both the pelvic and pectoral girdles are inside the shell. They must hoist themselves off the ground with legs that stick awkwardly out of the four corners of this inflexible box. In association with their very low rate of metabolism, tortoises can go for long periods without food or water. When food is available, they lay down enormous deposits of fat. When water is available, they are well hydrated, and it has been suggested that they can actually store excess water in their urinary bladder. They may stay in the water for days, just soaking, before they return to shore and to their feeding.
From the diary of George Little of the ship Dromo, May 11, 1807. Our 5 boats were all hoisted out at daylight, and 60 men went on shore with the intention of making 2 parties, one to take tortoise and the other turtle. We succeeded beyond our most sanguine expectations, having taken upward of 20 fine large turtle and as many tortoise, some of which were of immense size, weighing from 50 to 300 pounds. These creatures are the best fresh sea stock that can be procured, because they may be stored for months without food or water, and when prepared for cooking will be quite as fat as before.
First the buccaneers, who preyed on Spanish treasure ships. Later the sailors of the Pacific whaling fleet carried off hundreds of thousands of tortoises from the Galapagos Islands. By the end of the 19th century, settlers were invading the highlands where sailors had rarely gone, slaughtering tortoises for the valuable oil which could be rendered from their fat.
Naturalist Rollo Beck, writing in 1905. While at the ranch where nearly 50 men were at work, we were amazed at the reckless and heartless manner in which some of the natives destroyed the tortoises. The proprietor informed us that only the males were killed, but we noticed that the working people make little distinction in the sexes when killing for food. To show what has already been done by oil hunters, I took 2 photographs at the waterhole, where lay the largest number of tortoise skeletons. There were about 150 skeletons at this pool, and a half a mile away in another depression were about 100 more. The photograph of 7 tortoises at a pond was taken 10 miles from the ranch at 3,500 feet elevation. There the hunters had not yet been, but soon these will be discovered and go the way of the rest.
Now that man has established placental mammals on the Galapagos, the surviving tortoises find themselves in direct competition with the very grazers and browsers whose absence from the Galapagos made possible their spectacular evolution. On some of the islands, like Barrington, feral goats have simply removed the food on which the tortoises depend. Not only do these placental mammals move more rapidly than tortoises, but they are more efficient as grazers. Tortoises have no teeth to grind their food, and their digestion is both slow and ineffective. 2 to 4 weeks is required for food to pass through the gut of the tortoise. But tortoise droppings still contain a great deal of fibrous material, whereas with the wild donkeys, for example, the digestion is far more rapid, the breakdown of plant fibers is much more complete. Man also introduced predatory mammals to the Galapagos, including the domestic rat. The female tortoises lay their eggs in holes in the lower and drier parts of the islands, pack earth over them, and then return to the highlands. Rats and other predators cannot attack the armored adults directly, but they do dig up and destroy the eggs. As a direct or indirect result of what man has done in the Galapagos in the past 300 years, several races of tortoises have become extinct, and several of the remaining populations consist of only 4 or 5 surviving individuals. Starting in the early 60s, the Charles Darwin Foundation established a tortoise preserve on Santa Cruz Island. This preserve includes a hatchery and nursery for tortoises.
In Duncan Island now it's only full-grown tortoises. What was, when we saw, we was afraid their breeding condition was stopped one moment to the other, and for consequences, one of the race is going to be extinct.
How old is the youngest tortoise there?
The youngest tortoise what I found in Duncan Island can be over 60 years. It's only one. The thing is, after 2 years we was discovery. The rat destroyed completely the small tortoises after hatch out from the nest. Then only the solutions was to step out to help artificial this breeding, and then after we was looking for the nest, count the eggs and so on, we bring into the station where the young is coming out.
Do you plan to go back every year and bring back eggs here for this artificial?
Well, what I was proposed to work this until we have about over 100 young ones. I hope the next year I pass over 100 young ones.
Mm-hmm.
Our plan is about 6 months before we release, we try to use the same food what we have in Duncan Island.
Mm-hmm.
And we try to release in the best time of the year.
Mm-hmm.
That means after the rainy season, when it's not so hot and it's lots of food.
And do you think that if there are enough tortoises breeding on Duncan Island that they will keep the population up in spite of the rats?
Well, I doubt of that, because the rat is an animal which is never stop eating, you see. And they have this habit to eat the young tortoises. Even they don't eat, they're going to destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I am afraid. Only the solutions can be to find a way to exterminate the rats, because another way we don't want those tortoises to be completely destroyed.
Tortoises still remain in significant numbers up high on Santa Cruz in the preserve, but the largest populations are on Albemarle, which is the biggest of the island. On Albemarle, there are separate subspecies of tortoises on each of the 5 volcanoes which constitute the island. One of these, Volcan Alcedo, is quite high, extremely rugged, and supports a substantial tortoise population. The crater of Alcedo is a caldera, a volcano which has extruded lava from its interior and then collapsed to form a great basin with a high rim around the edge. Alcedo was volcanically active in 1954, and at that time there was a great earthquake, which in one area actually elevated the bottom of the sea as much as 15 feet above high tide. This elevated reef is snowy white from the encrusting corals and marine life that have bleached out in the sun, and at one point there is even an uplifted mangrove swamp whose dead roots now entwine bare rock high above the waterline. Inland, a sea of lava surrounds Alcedo and all the other volcanoes of Albemarle. This almost impassable lava plain has kept the 5 tortoise races of Albemarle isolated from one another and distinct. The outer slope of Alcedo is covered with progressively richer vegetation as altitude and moisture increase. As on all the islands, the tortoises have long since disappeared from these lower slopes. top of Alcedo extends above the persistent layer of stratus clouds, but the southeast trade winds that blow for about half the year carry in cool, moist air from the sea, causing the clouds to stack up against the mountain and spill over the rim into the caldera. Along this rim, the moisture of the cloud cover supports a plant association which really could be called a cloud forest. Here in this persistently moist area of heavy vegetation, a large population of tortoises persists. At night, they withdraw into shallow little pits or burrows. In the morning, they move slowly out, warm up in the sun, and then wander about, browsing and grazing during the daylight hours. The rim of the caldera is a full day's walk from the ocean. It's too far for the tortoise hunters to have come, and these animals have rarely or never been disturbed by human beings. The caldera, or collapsed lid of Alcedo, has produced a basin 8 or 10 miles on one axis and 6 or 8 miles on the other. As the southeast trades sweep over the rim of the volcano and drop down into the caldera, they're heated by compression, the clouds evaporate, and the floor of the caldera is a desert. Parts of the floor of the caldera have been covered at one time or another with hot lava. In some areas, the lava flowed out in a soft and viscous state, and here we can actually see the buried ridges and plates where it congealed. The caldera is still very active volcanically. All along its southern edge, there are fumaroles and vents with hot volcanic gases coming out. In many places, the ground is uncomfortably hot to the touch. The principal source of water for the tortoises on Alcedo is an overflow pool below a large geyser. Some of the tortoises spend their time here permanently. Others come to drink and then wander to more remote parts of the island for food. The movements of animals to and from the water have produced large dirt paths, almost like roads, which radiate out from the pool. In the early years of this century, when tortoise hunters were operating on the lower slopes of Alcedo, they used pack burros to carry the tortoises back to the sea. Some of the burros apparently escaped, and their descendants persist and thrive in the caldera as herds of wild donkeys. The burros on Alcedo, like the goats on other islands, represent a severe challenge to the survival of the tortoises. In the long haul, even if man does nothing, as long as these placental mammals persist, the future of the tortoises is very dim indeed.